Really, man? Right now?
What?
You're gonna do this right now. You're gonna do that thing that every other YouTuber has already done, all the territory that's already taken. You're gonna do that thing where you kind of duplicate yourself and do what every other YouTuber on this damn platform has done. Why don't you come up with at least one creative idea? Just
They're hard,
one.
man.
Just one. Oh, and you guys, get some higher freaking standards. Dick. What's up, guys? My name is Josh, and today we're going to be talking about the Monoprice Liquid Spark. And before we get into this, I want to talk about some of this thing's competition. The target market that this is really going for is against the Magni from Shit and the JDS Labs Atom. And it's kind of interesting because on the specs on their website, they actually list this at 50 ohms at 1.3 watts. Now, Monoprice sent me two other measurements from third-party companies who actually measured this amp, and I'm not sure why they're listing the power on their website as 1.3, because both of those measurements from those third parties came back as I think 1.5 or 1.6 at 50 ohms and about 2.4 at 32 ohms. So it's quite a powerful amplifier, and they're a little bit underselling it on the Monoprice website, which is very interesting. But the reason why I bring this up is because I am going to recommend this amplifier at the end of this review. And the reason why is because I think it actually takes an interesting place in the market. I know it's not the cleanest measuring amp in this price range that does basically what this does, and that crown, so to speak, would go to the JDS Labs Atom. But this has about twice the power that has, and the Magni has a little bit more power than this has. So this is kind of like a nice middle of the road where it's a lot of clean power while not being a total powerhouse like the Magni, which I'll compare against, but it's not as clean as the Atom, which for full transparency, I have not tried the Atom outside of RMAF. I haven't actually sat down and listened to it in my my apartment here, so I don't know for sure, but judging by the measurements, which I don't always recommend doing, but I'm going to for this circumstance, judging by the measurements, it's a much cleaner amp, but it's not nearly as powerful. So depending on what you're really going for, you have three different options, and this is one that, depending on the right circumstances, I will recommend, and we'll get more into those circumstances in the conclusion. And real quick before we get started, Monoprice did send this to me on a loan basis. I was supposed to have it for 30 days. It's been well over 30 days. I apologize, Monoprice. I appreciate you being nice and not getting too mad about it. And I do have to send this back. They're not paying, asking, or otherwise trying to influence me to say anything good or bad about this amp. So all thoughts and opinions are my own. That being said, let's go ahead and jump into the rest of this review. So regarding the physical build of this thing, it's kind of got that generic amp metal. You find this metal on like a lot of SMSL products. You probably felt one or two in your day. It's pretty average metal, I would say. I do like the design though. It's kind of sleek, somewhat unique. It's not like a total square or anything like that. I would say the build quality is probably about on par with a Magni in terms of how solid it feels, although the Magni from memory is a little bit heavier. But not by much. In the rear, it has a power input with a very long power brick that has a very long cable. So if you're cable managing, that's going to be a pain that you're going to have to deal with. Right and left RCA inputs and right and left RCA pre-outs. Then on the front, you have a power button, a 1/4 inch headphone output, a high-low gain switch, and a volume knob, and that high-low gain switch does affect the pre-outs on the back. And another thing about the pre-outs is they actually did a great thing, which I love seeing, is that when you plug in headphones, the pre-outs turn off. And I can't express to you how happy that makes me, because I always use pre-outs on amps for speakers, right? I would never really use it to string to another amplifier. That doesn't really make any sense to me. So it's always going to speakers, and if I'm putting on headphones, I obviously don't want the speakers playing. So when companies do stuff like this, it gets a huge thumbs up from me. Okay, so now onto the power aspects of this. Like I said before, it's about 2.4 watts at 32 ohms, about 1.5 or 1.6 in that ballpark at 50 ohms. So for a $100 amplifier, it's pretty strong. But all the power in the world doesn't really matter if it doesn't sound very good. So how does it sound? Actually super clean. Surprisingly, the dial turns to about 5 o'clock and I hit distortion about 4 o'clock. And that's on high gain. And I actually tested that with HE6s. Now I don't want that to scare you away necessarily. Most amplifiers will have distortion near the very end of their amplification. This one's no exception to that. But to be honest, on pretty much every headphone besides the HE6s that I was listening on, I wasn't getting past 12 o'clock. So I was getting nowhere near 4 o'clock for the majority of headphones. So getting to that distortion level wasn't really a problem. Now, there were two standout things for me on this amplifier in terms of the sonic signature. One, it doesn't lean warm or cold. It's a very neutral sounding amplifier, which is something that you could be looking for. I think you can definitely get a preference on what you like the sound of, and maybe like a little bit of compression like you generally get with like shit amplifiers. Now, not hating on shit amplifiers, but that's generally part of their sound signature, and that may be something you find enjoyable. This doesn't have extremely wide dynamics. An extremely dynamic amplifier would be like the THX AAA, but that's a completely different class of amplifier. But the point is, it's not extremely wide, but it's also not what I would consider to be perceivably compressed in any way at all. That is not something that the Magni, for example, was able to do. The Magni does sound slightly compressed. Keep in mind, I'm pulling that from memory. And I actually did like the Magni. I just understand that it's for specific headphones, it sounds great. And for specific requirements of the individual who would buy it, it's a great recommendation, and I'm still going to recommend it. But this, for most circumstances, is probably going to take over that recommendation, especially if you need power, because this provides almost all that power. But the main benefit over the Magni for this is the cleanliness, the neutrality, and that lack of compression that the Magni has. Now, another thing that stood out to me was actually top-end resolution with this, and it didn't seem to be driving something like the HD 800s with any issues. Like the HD 800s weren't getting really sibilant highs. In my experience, HD 800s with headphone amps like the Jotunheim, which don't really have this crazy resolution, which actually, when it comes to the category of resolution, at least out of the single-ended output, the Jotunheim doesn't even hold a candle to the Spark here. And because of that lack of resolution, that 800, yes, it's still a bright headphone, but it's able to resolve those highs a little bit better so they don't sound as necessarily sibilant and lacking in detail. Now, for speed, it's not the fastest amp out there, even for $100. I can't really think of another standout example for $100, but it's definitely not something that inherently stood out to me. Now, that being said, it's also not slow. It doesn't have, and this partially goes into that not being warm and not being too stark or cold or clinical either. It's kind of right in the middle, and speed tends to be kind of the same way for this. It's kind of right in the middle, especially for its class. Things definitely hit quickly and with impact, but not overly assertively so. Treble, mid-range, and bass, soundstage and imaging, it all seems to play really well out of this without having any sort of caveats or lack of detail in any category. I didn't feel like anything was missing. So before I talk about my conclusion, I actually want to talk about 2 or 3 other amplifiers that are kind of in the $100 range. One is going to be the Mica Origin. The Mica Origin is a great DAC amp for $100. I think it's a great budget option, either that or the Folded 2. I think those are both like stellar $100 options, but neither are as clean nor are they as powerful as this is. And the power versus cleanliness kind of ratio that this has going on is really in its favor. And comparatively, the Mica, and I'm pulling this from memory again, like a lot of these comparisons are from memory, except for the bigger amps that I have here in the Jotunheim. The Mica never really felt attentive to me, unless you were working off like a really efficient headphone, like an LCDX or something like that. It never felt like it was a super clean amp, whereas that's one of the first things I noticed with this is how tight everything feels with it. And that's something that I really enjoyed here. Now, to bring up the Magni comparison again, I think the Magni in certain categories does beat this out. In total power, I would power like something like Argon's off of the Magni. It's barely enough power, and it's definitely not necessarily clean. But I think for a headphone of that caliber in terms of requirement for power, I think it handles the Argons a little bit better than something like this would. So if you're stuck at $100 and you can only throw about $100 towards an amplifier, if you have a really hard to drive headphone, I still probably recommend the Magni, something like an Argon. And I'm trying to think of an example that would probably benefit from the Magni more than this, and really all that I can think of is like an Argon or some other variation of a T50 mod. Or I mean, just anything hard to drive. K712s are kind of popping into my head as somewhat difficult to drive, especially with the wide soundstage. But with the incredibly low efficiency headphones, I would still stick with the Magni unless the headphone inherently has a problem with resolution to begin with. The Magni is certainly not going to help with that. Then maybe look at something like the Mica Origin if you need a DAC amp for $100. or probably I'm assuming the JDS Labs Atoms because they make really good stuff for really high efficiency headphones. So headphones that are super efficient and easy to drive. And then everything in the middle of that you need a little bit of power for. You want something clean, but you don't need all the power in the world. This is going to be a great option for that kind of middle of the road thing. Think like HC600 levels of efficiency. So that's going to be kind of where I think this sits in the market. Do I recommend it? Absolutely. I honestly didn't have any caveats or problems using this. Nothing to really complain about. It functions well. It doesn't get incredibly hot. I guess the only thing I would complain about is that it's got these kind of pyramid shaped feet at the bottom. They're kind of like upside down pyramids, and they don't grip really well to the surface. So when you're plugging something in or something like pulls on the cable just a little bit, it actually doesn't have a lot of grip on the surface that it's on, so it slides really easily. I guess that would be a complaint if I had to make one. But yeah, other than that, I like this thing a lot. So I think that's gonna wrap it up, guys. I hope you like this review, and if you like reviews like this and you wanna see more in the future, then please consider hitting that subscribe button down below. And before you go, I have a real quick message about my Patreon. All right, guys. Peace. If my videos have helped you in any way, please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help the channel a lot. You will receive early access to videos like this one and an exclusive Patreon only behind the scenes video monthly. Patreon also helps with shipping costs and feeding my coffee addiction so that I can get up at 6 a.m. to make videos like this one.